The next thing I did was to mark 2.5 cm upward at the hem. Then I blended it back into the hem. Now I am cutting out the skirt along the seam line and I'm notching it on each line. I place my satin fabric on fold, then I drew a straight line from top to bottom just to serve as a guide for me to place my pattern. Because without this line, it's difficult to tell if the pattern is placed straight or slanted. Now I'm tracing around my skirt and adding all my necessary seam allowances. After that, I connected all my seam lines together with the help of my hip curve. And I measured the full length of my skirt from the side of the waist to the hem. Then I added all my seam allowances, but at the hem, I went upward by 2.5 cm and connected back to the hem. Now let's go over this measurement. So this is just a straight line to enable me place my pattern on the fabric. Then I traced around my pattern first. After that, I measured my zipper allowance. So ignore these lines that you are seeing here. This is just a straight line that goes down to the hem. So my zipper allowance is 4 cm. Then at this above the knee area, I measured 1.5 cm, which is about half an inch. So I'm also going to rule this 1.5 cm straight down, but I am going to connect it to this line like this. So it means this place has been scrapped out. This is where we'll be using here. Now I'm cutting out this fabric, but bear in mind that the fabric that we cut previously and even this one is our satin fabric. We have not yet cut out our lace fabric and our lining fabric. So now I'm going to notch each area of the hip at the side like I did with the previous pattern for the front, and I'm making sure that I highlight my darts. So I'm labeling the side and the back. So this is our lace fabric we're cutting right now. I just placed the satin fabric on top of it to get the exact shape. But mind you, our lace is a bit short, but we'll fill that up later. So you want to make sure that you cut out your lining, and this is my lining I am cutting out right now. So now we have our satin, our lace, and our fabric. The next thing I did was to use my all-purpose gum to glue my lace and my fabric together carefully. You do not want to create a mess, please. As soon as I was done, I smoothed everything out just to make sure that I do not have fabrics hanging around. So the next thing I'm going to do is to sew my dart at the back pattern or the back fabric. After sewing my dart, I'm going to sew along my center back. But mind you, when I start stitching from the waist, I'm going to use loose stitch. Then I'm going to back stitch to where my zipper would stop. So I finished sewing the center back and I'm pressing with my iron. After pressing with iron, I'm placing my front skirt fabric on top my back skirt fabric and I'm pinning along my seam line. Then I'm going to start sewing from above the knee where I have the curve at the knee line. And after sewing, I'm going to reconfirm my measurement just to make sure that everything is perfect. The next thing I did was to install my zipper. So I'm going to loosen the center back waist because I didn't backstitch that area. Now I have installed my zipper. The next thing I did was to measure from the hem of my skirt to the slit at the center back. What I have is 73 cm. So I'm folding my leftover satin fabric. I did mine 90 cm in length, but you can do anything above 75 cm if yours was like 73. So after cutting out my satin, I spread my lace fabric and I glued the lace to the satin. The next step is to attach this flay or triangle shape to the center back of our skirt. So I'm just going to sew it, and after sewing you can see that it's slightly longer than the skirt. That's because we want it to be flowy at the back. So I folded the skirt in half and blended that triangle into the side seam of the skirt, and this is what it looks like. So I'm just prepping my lining just the same way we did our satin fabric. So just make sure that if you sewed with a seam allowance of, let's say, 4 cm for your satin fabric, for your lining you have to sew with 3 cm. Next thing I did was to iron interfacing on my satin fabric and on my lining. Then I traced around it and added all my seam allowances. At the side, I added about 4.5 cm, but at the curves and at the hem, I added 1.5 cm. Then I put my notch mark on each piece. This is also a fusible fleece, but I'll be putting this only at the cup of the satin, not at the lining. Then I'm going to stitch it together. So after stitching the cup together, I trimmed off the excess, I ironed, I snipped it, then I ironed fusible interfacing just to hold my seam lines together. So after ironing, this is what it's looking like at the moment. Now I'm going to attach all my corset pieces together. Before I attach it together, I'm going to snip around the cup area on the corset, just so that it's easy for me to insert my cup, because this is a curve that we'll be sewing on. So this is me just sewing the cup, and this is what the satin cup and the lining cup look like at the moment. So I'm going to insert my underbrow wire, but I'll have to understitch the cup area. Now I'm inserting the brow wire and I'm creating my loops for my corset. I've made a video before on how to create a loop. You can go ahead and watch that video if you do not know how to create one. Next thing I did was to draw a straight line at the center back that I will attach my loop on. After that, I just mark multiple lines on my back bodice. Then I cut my Regline boning into shape. I ironed it and I attached it to those lines I drew. Now this is what the back bodice is looking like. This is a tulle net. I didn't really like the color, so I'm measuring about 1 yard and 15 inches. Then I'm using a synthetic dye to just change the color to a more brown skin tone. And this is what the tulle net looks like now. So I'm folding it into 4 and I'm placing my yoke pattern on it for the front and the back. So I'm pinning, I'm going to trace around it, and I'm also going to add my seam allowances. Since I added 1.5 cm to the bodies of the corset, I decided to do the same to the yoke of the corset. The total number of 2 I got from this was 2 each, but I needed to get 3, so I folded the fabric again to get the balance 3. Now I'm sewing the yoke and I'm snipping around it. I trimmed off the excess, then I'm pressing with my iron. Now I'm trimming out any excess fabric that I just poking out. This is my back yoke. I've sewn around the neck and I'm going to snip around it. Then I'm also going to sew the center back. After sewing, I snipped around it and I turned it inside out, as you can see. But at the center back, I did not trim out so much so that it can help to give support to the button or hook and eye that I'm going to put. So this is what my yoke looks like at the moment, and I'm putting the back pattern on top the front. Then I'm going to stitch it at the shoulder by spreading it open. So you want to start from the middle of the shoulder. That is where the front shoulder and the back shoulder meets. So you're going to start from the middle, sew to one end, then flip it the other way and continue from the middle to the other end. After sewing, you turn it back inside out to see what it looks like, to be sure that you are satisfied with the look before you backstitch. So you do not backstitch when you start sewing, you backstitch after you're satisfied with the look. Now I'm just pressing with iron, and the next thing I'm going to do is to place my yoke together. Now I'm going to carefully flip it inside out at the side just to enable me sew the armhole line together. So I'm going to start at the middle of the shoulder like we did. After sewing to one end, I'll repeat it on the other end. I'll also snip it, then I'll turn it inside out. Now I'm pressing again with iron. So this is the time to remove any piece of thread or fabric you can see clinging to the yoke. I'm carefully pinning the tool, and I'm going to sew at the edge just to hold my fabric together. Now I am attaching my yoke to the corset. So this is what it looks like, and I'm going to stitch where the underbra wire stops at the cup area. The next thing I'm going to do is to sew in my regline boning, and after sewing I'm going to place my back pattern of my yoke to my back pattern of my corset, and I'm going to stitch them together. And I'll repeat the same thing for the front. After stitching, I'm going to put both patterns together, sew them together at the side. So this is my bodice pattern that I'm attaching to my skirt pattern or skirt fabric. I'm just pinning the center front waist to the center front bodice. Then I'm going to slightly loosen the side seam of both the skirt and the bodice, because I want to attach the front bodice and the front skirt together separately, and the back bodice and the back skirt together separately. So after finishing that, this is what it looks like at the side. Now we're going to be doing a lot of flipping in and flipping out. So the next thing we're going to do now is to flip the dress in, just so that we can stitch back the side together. Then after stitching it together, we're going to flip it out again. So now we're going to set this aside, then go and prepare the lining for the bodice. So I'm just putting my lining together, but make sure that your lining is going to be bigger than your actual corset bodice. So after stitching my lining together, I'm going to put it wrong side to wrong side on my bodice, then flip it over just so that I can attach it now right side to right side. But first I have to pin. After pinning, then I'm going to stitch around it. So after stitching, this is what it looks like. Now I'm folding another piece of satin fabric and placing my center back bodice on top. Then I'm tracing around it just so that I can get my modesty panel. So after cutting out the shape of my modesty panel, I'm just going to sew around it, then turn it inside out. After that, I'll iron the modesty panel. Then I'm going to place it at my center back. So I'm placing the modesty panel on top of my center back. Then I'm putting my lining that I've attached on top the modesty panel. So the modesty panel is at the middle. Then I'm going to stitch it down. So this is what it looks like. Now I'm going to attach the skirt to the lining. of my bodice. So you're just going to slightly loosen the skirt at the side seam. Now I'm putting the dress into the lining, like I'm just wearing it into it. This is the lining for my bodice or my corset. So this is the lining. And this is the waist, the center back of my skirt. Lace, satin lining. Put them like this. There are different ways to go about this. I'm just showing you the method that I'm using. This is the center back of my skirt. Now I'm putting all pieces together and I'm pinning at the waistline. So after pinning, I'm going to stitch on that line or that area. Then I'm going to flip it inside out again for you to see what it looks like. But make sure that at the zipper area, you do not break your needle. So this is what it looks like after I finish stitching. Now I am going to flip the zip area together, but I will cut out the excess zip first. So I'm flipping the lining at the center back on top the zipper. Then I'm going to pin and stitch as close as possible on top my zipper line. So after stitching, you are just going to stitch at least 2 inches below your zip allowance line. And don't forget to press with iron once you are done. So I'm going to flip this inside out again. I told you there's a lot of flipping in and out. So after flipping inside, I'm going to measure about 1.5 cm at the hem of the dress, and I'm going to trim it out. But make sure that at the area where you trimmed out, you backstitch it. So I'm pulling the waist of my lining and the waist of my fabric together. Then I'm going to stitch them so that the lining does not start pulling underneath my dress. I want everything to be secured. So I'm just going to stitch to the best of my ability. I do not necessarily have to stitch to the end of the waist. I just need to hold both waists together. Now I'm marking about 8 inches just on my lining. Then I'm going to loosen that part. After I loosen it, I'm going to backstitch that area. That's the beginning where I loosen and the end where it stops, just so that my hand can pass freely and so that it doesn't loosen beyond that point. So I'm just patching the lace area that is short on the satin, and I'm using the border from the first layer of lace to serve as an edge for this new satin that I'm patching. So I'm going to be using my UHU gum, but make sure that you loosen the side of your dress just with about 2 inches, because you want them to be separated so that you can easily lay your lace patch on top the dress without it bulging. You want to continue this process until you have been able to successfully cover up all the areas that were short of lace fabric. Now this is what my dress at the hem looks like. So now I'm going to put my lining and my lace right side to right side, but first I'm turning it inside out. So I prefer to start from the center front of my dress. So the center front, you are going to fold it in half and get the middle by creating a notch. So you do that for your lining and your dress. Then you are going to pin around it by making sure that the side seam aligns. Remember that our lining is slightly bigger than our dress, so we are going to create little pleats on the lining just so that it can align properly with the dress. So after creating the pleats, I pinned and then I sewed both hems together. So I'm going to pull the dress out through that opening that we had originally, just to turn it inside out. So after turning it inside out, I'm going to put my hand through that same opening so that I can bring out just the hem of the dress. Now this is the hem of the dress. I'm going to put crinoline there, and I'm also going to put fusible interfacing, what some people call hemming gum. Then I'm going to stitch everything together. This will help the hem to remain crisp and wavy at the same time. So this is the hemming gum alongside the crinoline. Now I am just attaching it to the hem of my dress. So I'm pushing back the dress into the lining. And I'm ironing. So you want to be careful when you're ironing. You want to make sure that you've pushed the lining inside a bit. You don't want the lining to be out. So now I'm putting my satin fabric on fold, and I'm just making a 79 cm long width of fabric. This is going to serve as a structured sleeve that will hang from the under bust at the front to the back. But first, we will have to iron fusible interfacing on it. I'm also cutting another 79 cm long strip of fabric that will serve as a lining for the previous one I cut. So on one of the fabric, I am going to iron just medium weight fusible interfacing, and on the other one I'm going to iron what some people call collar stay or deco weight interfacing. This is a bit stiff and hard. So I'm just marking 3 cm. Then I'm going to divide the 3 cm into 2 so that I can have 1.5 cm and my 3 cm mark on each side of the rectangular fabric. So the next thing I'm going to do is to get the middle of my fabric. You can sew as many boning as possible. So I'm marking another 1.5 cm line on my fabric, and I'm going to sew around the edge of this rectangle. So after sewing the edge of the rectangle, this is what it looks like. I also went ahead to sew the middle, please. Then I ironed. Now I'm going to insert the boning, but make sure that the boning is a bit shorter than the fabric because you also need seam allowance. So I'm folding another scrap of fabric, and these are the measurements on the screen. This is actually the bicep of the person that is going to wear the dress, and this is the width of the sleeve. One of these pieces will serve as the lining while the other will serve as the main fabric, but make sure you iron fusible interfacing. Then I stitch both of them together, turn them inside out, then pressed it with iron. So I'm just folding in and sewing, and this is going to serve as a drop shoulder for one of the hand. So on the long rectangular fabric, I just used a basting stitch with needle and thread, and I created like a gather. This was very tough because it was strong. Now I'm attaching it to the center of my dress at the under bust. Then I'm carefully folding the second end of the dress, pinning it. Then I'm going to use a machine stitch to just run across. But if you're unable to use a machine stitch, you can just slightly stitch with your hand neatly. So it's totally up to you to either create pleats at this second end of your fabric, or if you want to leave it straight, is up to you. But I'm going to be attaching this to the center back of my dress, and I'm using a needle and thread. So mind you, once you are done, you can put an applique to cover your stitch mark at the center back. Now at the bust area, I decided to put some applique. You can decide to use glue, or you can decide to hand stitch it, but I decided to use glue because it was quicker for me. I'm just gluing it, and this is totally based on your creativity. This is what the dress looks like. Once you're done, stitch the structured sleeve to the tulle net so that it can stand on its own. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care and bye for now.